Imagine building the most powerful NASCAR engine Ford ever conceived, nearly 500 horsepower, with valves big enough to swallow rival Hemis, then squeezing it into a Mustang that could barely contain it, just to slip past a rulebook technicality. The Boss 429 was born from a 500-car NASCAR mandate, but what began as pure racing brilliance turned into a street legend nobody actually wanted. How did chasing the checkered flag create a Mustang so extreme that dealers and insurance companies wanted nothing to do with it? Here is how engineering ambition collided with reality. If you want to hear about the Mustang Ford couldn't really sell, hit subscribe. NASCAR in the late 1960s was a battleground, and the rulebook was the front line. The Grand National Division laid down a simple but brutal mandate. If a manufacturer wanted to race a new engine, they had to build at least 500 street-legal cars with that engine under the hood. No paperwork tricks, no prototypes, real cars on the road, registered and available for anyone to buy. This was the infamous homologation rule, and it forced Detroit's biggest names into an arms race that went far beyond the track. For Ford, the stakes were clear. Chrysler's 426 Hemi had been dominating ovals across the country, racking up wins and headlines. The Hemi's reputation was so strong, it practically bullied rivals into the background. Ford's own 427 and 428 engines were good, great even, but they were built on aging designs, and the company knew the Hemi was not going anywhere unless they brought something entirely new to the fight. That something was the 429 semi-hemi, a power plant designed from scratch to take on Chrysler's best. But here is where the rulebook got personal. NASCAR did not care how much money Ford spent developing the engine or how advanced the technology was. If Ford wanted to see the 429 on the starting grid, they had to sell 500 of them to the public. Not in full-sized Galaxies, not in Thunderbirds, but in a car that could absorb the cost and carry the image. The Mustang was Ford's icon, the car that had redefined American performance just a few years earlier. It was the logical candidate for a halo project, even if it was not designed for a big block experiment. But Ford's product planners were not thinking about daily drivers or dealership headaches. Their job was to get the 429 into NASCAR, whatever it took. The Mustang, for all its style and swagger, did not have an engine bay anywhere close to big enough for the new powerhouse. That did not matter. The rule said 500 cars, so 500 cars it would be, no matter how much metal had to be moved or how many headaches it caused down the line. Every decision from this point on was shaped by that number, 500. It was the difference between racing glory and missing the show entirely. The engineers, the planners, even the accountants at Ford all had to play by NASCAR's rules. The rivalry with Chrysler, the pressure from the racing program, and the relentless drive to win on Sunday and sell on Monday all collided in that single, stubborn requirement. The Boss 429 was not born out of passion for street performance. It was born because the rulebook demanded it. And for Ford, that meant bending a Mustang until it could carry a monster. The Boss 429 engine wasn't just big, it was a technical marvel built for one thing, winning at NASCAR speeds. Ford's engineers didn't settle for a warmed-over big block. They started with a blank sheet and drew up a cylinder head that looked more like it belonged in a science lab than a Detroit assembly line. The combustion chambers weren't true hemispheres like Chrysler's Hemi, they were a crescent shape, and engineers called it the semi-hemi. That design let air and fuel swirl and tumble with almost no resistance. The result was flow numbers that made every other Ford head look like a clogged drain. The valves were massive, 2.28 inches on the intake side and 1.9 inches on the exhaust. For comparison, those valves were bigger than what you'd find in most race cars of the era, never mind a street machine. The ports were so large and straight, you could practically drop a golf ball through them and watch it rocket out the other side. This wasn't show-off engineering. The semi-hemi head and giant valves meant the 429 could breathe deep at high RPM, exactly what NASCAR demanded for sustained speed on super speedways. Ford officially rated the Boss 429 at 375 horsepower, but everyone in the know understood that was a joke. The real number was closer to 500 horsepower, sometimes more with a few tweaks. Ford lowballed the rating to avoid catching the eye of insurance companies, but the engine's true potential was an open secret. Crane cams and other tuners dyno-tested stock Boss 429s and routinely saw numbers north of 425 horsepower with the factory setup. Swap in headers, ditch the emissions gear, and 600 horsepower wasn't out of reach. The same basic engine in NASCAR trim was putting David Pearson on the podium. But even as a street engine, the Boss 429 was overbuilt. The block was cast iron with 4 bolt mains and a forged steel crankshaft. The heads were aluminum to save weight and shed heat, and every piece inside was designed to survive 7,000 RPM laps. The valve train changed from hydraulic lifters in 1969 to solid lifters in 1970, letting the engine spin higher without valve float. The carburetor, a 735 cubic feet per minute Holley, was actually smaller than what some lesser Mustangs got, a weird move forced by emissions rules. It was like putting a garden hose on a fire hydrant. The engine wanted to gulp more air, but the carburetor and intake held it back on the street. In race trim, with the right manifold and a bigger carburetor, the Boss 429 could finally show its teeth. Every inch of this engine screamed race car. The heads alone were a marvel. Oval ports, canted valves at a 30-degree angle, and a special Wills ring sealing system instead of a regular head gasket. That meant the Boss 429 could handle insane cylinder pressures without blowing itself apart. Ford didn't build this engine for comfort or convenience. They built it to survive 500 miles at Daytona, pedal to the floor, lap after lap. And that's exactly what it did. The downside was simple. All this brilliance came with a price. The engine was huge, wider, taller, and heavier than anything the Mustang had ever seen. Fitting it under the hood took more than a shoehorn. It required a complete re-engineering of the front end, a story that starts with Kar Kraft and a whole lot of cutting and welding. Kar Kraft's Brighton, Michigan shop became the proving ground for one of the wildest experiments in muscle car history. Ford's own assembly line could not handle what was coming, so partially built Mustang bodies rolled off the line and straight onto trucks bound for Kar Kraft, where the real work began. The problem was simple to describe and nearly impossible to solve. The Boss 429 engine was so wide, so tall, and so heavy that the Mustang's front end needed a total overhaul just to make it fit. The shock towers, those big metal uprights designed to cradle a small block, stood in the way like stubborn gatekeepers. Kar Kraft's fabricators did not just nudge them aside, they cut, beat, and welded the towers outward by nearly 2 inches, reshaping the entire front structure so the enormous aluminum valve covers could clear. The upper A-arms were moved out half an inch and dropped a full inch lower, while the lower arms were pushed even farther out. Every adjustment was an answer to a single question. How do you shoehorn a NASCAR engine into a car never meant to carry it? That was just the start. The battery, which had always lived in the Mustang's engine bay, got evicted to the trunk, not for style points, but because there was simply no room left up front. The oil cooler followed it, tucked into the trunk as well, because the engine's heat output threatened to overwhelm any standard cooling setup. Every Boss 429 left Kar Kraft with a trunk that doubled as a utility closet, packed with gear that had nowhere else to go. The hood had to be hacked and refitted with a scoop big enough to swallow a small dog, all so the carburetor could breathe without choking on its own horsepower. Even the front suspension geometry was reworked, with custom spindles and braces installed to handle the extra mass and keep the car from folding in half under its own weight. This was not a production line. It was a low-volume, high-skill operation, with every car essentially hand-finished by welders and fabricators who had to improvise solutions on the fly. The factory part numbers might have matched, but no 2 Boss 429s were exactly alike once Kar Kraft was finished. Ford lost money on every single unit, and they knew it. But the rules were the rules. NASCAR wanted 500 street cars, and Kar Kraft's crew delivered. They built 859 in 1969 and 500 more in 1970. The cost did not matter. What mattered was that Ford could say, with a straight face, that the Boss 429 was a real production Mustang. Underneath the skin, though, it was more a Kar Kraft creation than anything that rolled off Dearborn's line. Every cut, weld, and relocated part told the same story. This was a car built for one reason only, and compromise was never part of the plan. The Boss 429 engine didn't just fill the Mustang's engine bay, it tipped the entire car forward, both literally and figuratively. The numbers tell the story before you even turn the key. Compared to the 428 Cobra Jet, the Boss 429 added roughly 150 extra pounds, all of it packed right over the front wheels. That kind of weight isn't just a statistic, it's a sentence. The final tally was a 58-42 front-to-rear split, a figure that would make any chassis engineer wince. In a world where balance is everything, the Boss 429 was a heavyweight prizefighter wearing concrete shoes. On paper, the Mustang still looked like a muscle car, but behind the wheel, the extra mass up front changed everything. Take a corner at anything above a crawl, and the car answered with a stubborn push. Classic understeer. The front tires gave up before the rear ones even knew there was a problem. It didn't matter how hard you cranked the wheel, the nose wanted to go straight, and the only thing you could do was back off and hope the front end found grip before you ran out of road. Test drivers of the era called the steering heavy and numb, the car reluctant to change direction, and the overall feel more like a loaded pickup than a nimble pony car. The Boss 429 was brilliant in a straight line, but put it on a twisty road and the front end plowed like a snow truck in January. Tire life became a running joke among owners. The Polyglass F60x15 tires, wide as they were, wore down in record time. All that weight and torque up front meant the outer edges of the front tires took a beating, especially if you drove the car the way the badge on the fender dared you to. Some owners learned to rotate tires as often as they changed the oil just to keep up. Even the suspension, beefed up by Kar Kraft with custom geometry and stiffer springs, couldn't fully compensate. The modifications helped keep the car from folding in half, but they couldn't rewrite physics. The Mustang's proportions were never meant to handle a NASCAR V8, and the result was a car that felt out of its element anywhere but a drag strip or a long, empty highway. The irony is hard to miss. Ford's engineers moved the battery to the trunk, reworked the suspension, and did everything short of putting ballast in the back seat. But the 429's mass still sat up front, daring anyone to try and tame it. For most drivers, the Boss 429 wasn't just more car than they could handle, it was more car than the Mustang could handle too. Driving a Boss 429 Mustang was never just a matter of turning the key and rolling out of the driveway. The first sign that you were in for a different kind of experience stared you right in the face. A hood scoop so tall it blocked your view of the front corners. Forget seeing the curb or that stray tricycle. The scoop was a monument to airflow and a daily reminder that this car was not built for parallel parking. Squeezing the car into a garage became an exercise in geometry, with many owners discovering the scoop would scrape before the bumper even got close to the back wall. If your garage door had a low frame, you either parked outside or risked a permanent fiberglass tattoo on the scoop itself. Visibility was not the only thing sacrificed for horsepower. The transmission was a 4-speed manual, no automatic option, not even as a dealer-installed upgrade. The Boss 429's torque would have shredded any slush box Ford could offer, so every owner got the close ratio top loader, whether they wanted it or not. For street driving, this gearbox was less a convenience and more a challenge. First gear was so tall that getting the car moving in traffic felt like launching a boat with a rope tied to a dock. Stalling at a green light was not just possible, it was almost a rite of passage. The clutch was heavy, the shifter stiff, and the whole setup demanded you pay attention or pay the price. Highway cruising was another lesson in compromise. With 3.91 or 4.30 rear gears as standard, the Boss 429 roared along at 70 miles per hour with the engine spinning well above 3,500 revolutions per minute. Forget about relaxed freeway driving. Long trips meant a constant drone from under the hood and a gas gauge that seemed to drop as fast as the speedometer climbed. Owners learned to keep a close eye on temperature and oil pressure too. The relocated trunk oil cooler did its best, but the engine's race-bred thirst for lubrication and cooling made traffic jams and summer days a test of patience and nerves. All these quirks piled up fast. The car was more at home idling at a car show or tearing down a quarter mile than it was crawling through a drive-through or running errands. Daily drivers found themselves fighting heavy steering, sweating over blind spots, and explaining to neighbors why their new Mustang sounded like a stock car and could not fit in the garage. For most, the Boss 429 was a lesson in how a car built for NASCAR glory could make every trip to the grocery store feel like a qualifying lap at Talladega. The price for owning a legend was not just paid at the dealership, it was paid every single day behind the wheel. Insurance companies in 1969 took one look at the Boss 429 Mustang's spec sheet and reached for the red pen. The numbers did not lie: 429 cubic inches, racing pedigree, and a reputation for trouble. For the insurance industry, this was the kind of car that turned actuarial tables upside down. Some companies refused to write policies for Boss 429 Mustangs at all. Others quoted premiums so high they made the sticker price look like a down payment. Young buyers, the crowd Ford counted on for Mustang sales, were especially out of luck. For a 20-something with a clean record, insuring a Boss 429 could cost more than the car itself in a single year. The formula was brutal but simple: big block engine, massive horsepower, and a history of muscle car accidents meant risk. Even though Ford tried to hide the engine's real output with an official 375 horsepower rating, actuaries were not fooled. Underwriters saw the semi-hemi heads, the race hardware, and the 500 horsepower rumors. The result? Premiums 2 or 3 times higher than a standard Mustang GT, with some quotes running well past $1,000 a year in $1970. That is before you even counted gas, tires, or repairs. For many buyers, the insurance office was where the Boss 429 dream ended. Agents had a routine: see Boss 429 on the application, shake their heads, and steer customers towards something with less bite. Stories circulated of would-be owners walking out of dealerships, insurance quote in hand, looking pale. Some tried to game the system by registering the car under a parent's name or using rural addresses, but companies caught on fast. The message was clear: if you wanted to drive Ford's baddest Mustang, you'd better have deep pockets and a forgiving insurance agent. For most, the financial barrier was as real as the horsepower. The Boss 429 became a car you could admire from a distance. But owning one was a whole different story. Dealers across the country watched Boss 429s roll off delivery trucks like ticking time bombs for their bottom line. Ford's allocation policy was simple: every major dealer got one whether they wanted it or not. These were not cars you could tuck into the back lot and forget. A Boss 429 took up prime floor space, drew the wrong kind of questions, and sat stubbornly under showroom lights while buyers walked by, eyes wide at the price tag and the insurance horror stories. Sales managers tried every trick in the book. Some offered discounts that would make a bargain hunter blush, chopping hundreds off the sticker just to move the car off their books. Others bundled the Boss 429 with trade-in deals or sweetened financing, hoping someone would bite. The reality was simple: even with a markdown, most buyers were not interested in a car that cost more to insure than to buy, handled like a dump truck in corners, and could not even fit in a standard garage. A few dealers, desperate to clear inventory, turned to the only market left: drag racers. Some Boss 429s were sold straight to local speed shops or weekend warriors, stripped of street trim, and sent down the quarter mile where their NASCAR DNA could finally breathe. Meanwhile, racing teams looking for a competitive edge skipped the whole car and bought bare 429 engines directly from Ford. They did not need the Mustang's compromised shell, just the power plant that let them chase trophies on Sunday. The irony was hard to miss. Ford built the Boss 429 Mustang to satisfy a rule book, not a customer. Dealers became unwitting middlemen in a transaction nobody wanted to make. The cars sat, the discounts grew, and the only real winners were the racers who got their hands on the engine without paying for the rest. For the people on the showroom floor, the Boss 429 was a problem to solve, not a dream to sell. On the racetrack, the Boss 429 engine finally got to prove what all those sleepless nights at Kar Kraft and Ford Engineering were really about. In 1969, the car to beat in NASCAR was no longer a Chrysler Hemi. It was David Pearson's Ford Torino, running the very same 429 semi-hemi that had turned the Mustang into a street oddity. Pearson, nicknamed the Silver Fox, took that engine and made history. He did not just win a few races, he dominated the entire season. Out of 54 starts, Pearson took home 11 victories and finished in the top 5 a staggering 42 times. That kind of consistency was not luck or circumstance. It was the direct result of the 429's relentless power, its high-revving lungs, and the kind of durability that could survive 500 miles at Daytona or Talladega without breaking a sweat. Pearson clinched the 1969 NASCAR Grand National Championship, putting Ford right where they wanted to be, at the top, with a trophy in hand and Chrysler's Hemi-powered Dodges and Plymouths in the rearview. The 429 engine did not just hold its own, it set the pace. On super speedways, where top speed and sustained power mattered most, the semi-hemi's airflow and brute strength made it the engine to beat. Crew chiefs and rival drivers took notice. The Ford camp, battered by years of Hemi dominance, finally had a weapon that could go toe-to-toe with the best Mopar had to offer. Every lap Pearson ran, every checkered flag he grabbed, was a vindication of Ford's gamble. The homologation headaches, the hand-built Mustangs that sat unsold on dealer lots, the insurance nightmares, all of it faded into the background as Pearson and the Boss 429 engine rewrote the NASCAR script. Ford's mission was clear from the start: build an engine that could win at the highest level, no matter what it cost on the street. In 1969, the scoreboard told the truth. The Boss 429 was not just a monster under the hood, it was a champion where it counted most. Ford's production planners had a simple target: build just enough Boss 429 Mustangs to satisfy NASCAR's rulebook, then stop. The numbers are almost surgical. 859 cars rolled out in 1969, followed by exactly 500 more in 1970. That's a grand total of 1,359 Boss 429 Mustangs, barely more than the minimum required for homologation. Compare that to the Boss 302, another street-legal racer from the same era. In 1969 alone, over 7,000 Boss 302s left the factory, finding homes with eager buyers who wanted a car that handled as well as it hustled. The Boss 429? It was rare because it had to be, not because Ford wanted to create an instant collectible. Unlike most muscle cars of the time, the Boss 429 did not benefit from pent-up demand or a waiting list at every dealership. These cars were built to check a box for NASCAR, not to win over the public. Production was limited by design and by necessity. The hand-modified process at Kar Kraft slowed things down, but so did the reality that dealers could not move them off the showroom floor. Ford's planners kept the run tight, with no illusions about mass market appeal. The company poured money into each unit, losing on every sale, but the goal was never profit, it was eligibility. The result is a car that stands out in the Mustang lineage for its scarcity as much as for its engineering. With only 1,359 produced, the Boss 429 is a statistical outlier, a blip on the production charts. Its rarity was not manufactured hype, it was a byproduct of regulatory compliance and market indifference. When the rules changed in 1971 and NASCAR no longer needed a street version, Ford shut the program down without hesitation. The Boss 429's low production numbers, once a sign of its awkward fit in the marketplace, would eventually become its greatest asset when collectors started paying attention decades later. By the late 1990s, the Boss 429 Mustang had quietly transformed from a showroom headache into a collector's prize. The same car that once sat unsold under dealership lights, discounted and dismissed, now drew crowds at auction houses. Rarity played its hand first. Only 1,359 were ever built, and decades of drag racing, parts swaps, and accidents had thinned their ranks. As collectors and historians started tallying survivors, the Boss 429's scarcity became impossible to ignore. But it was not just about the numbers. The car's reputation as too much for the street turned from a warning into a badge of honor. The engineering honesty, Ford's refusal to hide what the car really was, became the very thing that made it desirable. Modern buyers did not see a compromised Mustang. They saw a rolling piece of NASCAR history, a snapshot of the moment when the rulebook forced Detroit to build with zero pretense. The Boss 429 did not pretend to be practical. It was a homologation special in the purest sense, a race engine barely tamed, jammed into a body that could barely contain it. Prices followed the story. By the early 2000s, Boss 429s routinely crossed the block at $200,000 to $300,000. The rarest, lowest mileage examples, especially those with original Kar Kraft documentation, broke $400,000, sometimes even $500,000. That is more than most houses, and a far cry from the days when dealers could barely give them away. Auction catalogs now list the Boss 429 alongside the most coveted American muscle, and every sale comes with a knowing nod to its origins. In collector circles, the Boss 429 stands as proof that honesty, even when it is awkward or inconvenient, eventually gets its due. No one calls it the best driving Mustang. They call it the most honest. The car did exactly what it was built to do. It won races, it broke rules, and decades later, it broke the bank. Today, a car once unwanted now commands $500,000, not for how it drove, but for what it enabled. The Boss 429 proves that rulebook loopholes and engineering gambles can shape legends more than market demand ever will. As modern regulations push manufacturers to the edge, the story repeats. Sometimes greatness is born from compromise, not perfection. Would you chase power at any cost, or settle for what fits? Let me know in the comments.